right, thank you for joining today. We're hosting Scott Jensen, the Chief Executive Officer of the National Veterans Small Business Coalition. And before we get started, Scott, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and
Yeah,
maybe a little bit about how you transitioned from a very positive career in the Marine Corps into what you do now?
yeah, thanks, Karen. It's great to be with you all. I'm Scott Jensen, currently the NVSBC CEO, also a small business owner. That's what kind of got me into the work that I do now. I'm a retired Marine. I was a helicopter pilot, spent 27 years in the Marine Corps, uh, made it to the rank of colonel. I was blessed with, a lot of good opportunities and everything. And it's interesting, this topic, and part of the reason I decided, that I wanted to participate with you all on this is, transition is hard, and it doesn't matter what rank or what what career path you take. You'd think that a Marine colonel, somebody who's been around, had a successful career, a lot of opportunities. My transition wasn't much easier than anybody else's. And that's part of the reason I do things like this, is to help coach and mentor others who are working through that. And in many regards, I'd say I had what on the surface would look like a very successful transition. I went into a nonprofit space and a rather well-respected role at a very well-known nonprofit in higher education and supporting leadership programs. But that's on the surface. Behind the scenes, I was taking a job for a title, wasn't taking it, and the money, wasn't really thinking about whether it fit my passions, and frankly, I had a couple of those throughout the first couple of years of my transition, where I was getting to a point where I wasn't sure I could keep a job. I'd had 27 great years in the Marine Corps, and then you jump into a whole different line of work, a whole different area, and not sure how you define yourself.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't have myself well defined as I transitioned, and so I try to. That's kind of one of my passions now, is to helping those who are transitioned have a better sense of themselves,
Right.
and how to evaluate themselves before they make some decisions that prevent them from maybe having to learn some of the hard lessons that I learned in the process.
And do you think that, I mean, obviously there's that inner work that has to happen. How much of that though is the language issue and the translating what this skill set in the service looks like compared to a very similar skill set in the civilian sector, but very different vocabulary?
Yeah, I think there's two sides to that. I think it's helping military members who are in transition understand the qualities that they have in a civilian way is horrible. And I would say we really do a poor job of that. I have a daughter right now that's in transition. She's a Navy pilot. She's getting ready to transition out. And, I can't believe how long ago, 2016 is when I got out, but, it seems like yesterday, but I don't see it much better with her and her colleagues and peers. And, and one thing is, as you say, translating. What does my experience translate? How do civilian organizations see that? That's a, you know, that's one part of it, but also giving yourself credit for what things equal to, right? And I see this even after I transitioned and was asking for references from a retired general, a general officer in the Marine Corps who was retiring. And he says, "Gosh, Scott, your claimed CEO was part of your, as part of your role on your resume here. I just never thought about that." I'm like, I was a commanding officer of all of aviation assets in Afghanistan in combat operations. I was responsible for every element, administratively, operationally, financially, of what that organization did. I reported to a board of senior people.
Yep.
Who, what doesn't that define a CEO's role? And this general officer, more senior than me, said, "You're right." I
I'm a
never thought
CEO
of it that
too.
way. I was a CEO more than you were a CEO. I mean, and so and that's a very extreme example, but what I really see day in and day out, particularly among the junior ranks, Karen,
Mhm.
is military members who don't give themselves or don't understand to give themselves the credit for both the technical skills they have, but also the soft, what we often call the soft skills, and it is a struggle that we haven't figured out.
Yeah. And that's
Let alone
interesting.
then translating that to those people who are looking to hire or create opportunities for them as well, and them understanding what all that
Mhm.
means as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. So the work that you do is helping them do that piece, which I think is fascinating because as you were talking, I was thinking about, you know, one of the challenges I had was I knew I could do so much more, but civilian positions are often fairly narrow. And in the military, your expertise, right? Whatever your MOS is a part of your position. But sometimes it's the smallest part because the largest part is actually the leadership, the management, the logistics, everything that goes behind the scenes. So the
Yeah.
expertise that you can get hired for in the civilian sector, that's only one part of who you've become in the service. And without knowing how different the civilian sector is, it can be very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. And excuse me, we do it to ourselves too, because we think very narrowly that if the words don't match, like the CEO role, I'm cheating, I'm lying, I'm not being honest, and we and trying to help people understand that there's nothing magic about a title or a role or a responsibility in a civilian job in many cases. I'm not saying being dishonest. If you don't do something, you didn't do something.
Right.
To your point, a logistics manager, in the roles that you and I had in the military, even at very junior ranks,
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of logistics management that goes into that. There's a lot of human resource management that goes into that. Having a willingness to claim those types of expertise, if it's part of a job description or part of what's being, we need to have a willingness to give ourselves the grace to do that.
Yeah.
And our programs, though, in transitions particularly, need to help people to do that. If you're in a technical position, cybersecurity or communications, or there's some translatable skills there.
Mm-hmm.
What about the folks who are an infantry Marine, or
Yeah.
Army, or those, a Navy, a bosun's mate, or something that they often I see them kicking themselves in the butt saying, I was just
Right.
an infantryman. I was just a bosun's mate. I was just a yeoman, whatever that may be. And it's like, well, let's break that down. And to your point, what were the responsibilities that you had?
Mm-hmm.
That sounds a lot like someone who is managing a lot of human resource capital. That sounds a lot like someone who had some pretty strenuous logistics supply chain requirements. Do you agree with that? Yes, I do. Then claim it.
Mm-hmm.
And then
I
be
think
able
it's
to articulate that in a civilian way. That's the other part, right? Is
right.
not using acronyms and unit designations and things like that. Nobody knows what that means. I see that. We see that a huge problem with that as well.
Yeah, and I think I'm going to share one thing and then excellent transition into one of my next questions. But when you think about there's a million credentials in the market, right? Credential Engine tracks all of the credentials that are
Yeah.
available. There's other agencies that do the same. So the estimation right now is that there's over a million credentials provided to people in the United States. How many of our military who are transitioning end up earning credentials that they don't really need simply to validate what they already know so that it can be translated? Like, do you think there's some duplication there, or do you think it's just the best way to make that transition or that translation?
The people I talk to, if they mention a credential, I ask them why. What do you intend? Understand yourself, understand where you're going towards, and then understanding why are you going after the credential. The two big ones we always see is an MBA and PMP, right? I mean, those are kind of two of the big ones if we're talking about that. Then there's academic, either a master's or a PhD in something and pursuing that. And all those are knowable if you have a reason to do it and everything. I do feel like society, and you can't look through job descriptions. You can't look on LinkedIn and when they recommend a job, and this is how many people have these, served at this level or have these credentials, right? So it's foisted on you. And I don't know the answer in some regard is when I hire people, I say, okay, it's great. You have an MBA. I try not to put those in there if it's not something that's absolutely critical. But I fear that there are a lot of civilian roles that use that as a screening tool too. And I fear that our veterans are missing out on opportunities where they have all of the tools to do program management. They don't have a PMP. Who cares? I mean, I get it, but who cares really if they can do the job? I see in my position, particularly because I work with a lot of entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial development programs, that the equivalent of PMP in that role is the MBA, right? And I see young veterans come out that have all the tools to be a successful entrepreneur. They understand discipline, resiliency, but they also do budgeting and logistics and all those things. But they've convinced themselves, because society has convinced them, that you don't have an MBA and you weren't an officer, or you didn't go to a service academy or whatever it is, that they're not capable of doing what they're trying to pursue, or they don't consider it because they self-eliminate themselves from those certifications. So I'm always very fearful that people are self-selecting. On one hand, I'm worried that the civilian world isn't giving our veterans a break or an understanding, and their spouses, by the way, not just the veterans, but their spouses. But I believe there's a lot more self-selection than there is corporate selection of those certifications, and I just don't want people to self-select. And then I think the other side of your question was, I don't want people to spend money and their resources and time on something they don't need. So my advice is that, if you're being very direct, and I want to be a data scientist, well, you're going to need to get a PhD and pursue something like that. Okay, if that's your goal, then set those goals and pursue those goals. If you're doing it because you think you need it for something, I really encourage people to take a second look at that and make sure it's the right decision, and maybe take a few swings before you decide to go down that path.
Okay. And I think where we are with the transitioning of service members, right, which I think it's about 200,000 each year make the transition from military to civilian. It seems like we're trying really hard. When I look back to the 90s and the early 2000s, it was a lot of, you went through a resume workshop and good luck. Now there's organizations out there like 50 Strong and others that are, really partnering with DoD. And then you also have things like Army Cool, and they're starting to let military out like kind of 6 months early to do apprenticeships. Have you seen any, though, that have been super successful? Do you see a model out there that could be scaled to help make better, I guess, relationships between this position in the military could equate to this position because there's a direct line, but it could also do all of these things, right? There's tons of work, been great work done for CDL, but not every transportation specialist wants to come out and be a CDL driver, right? So
Right.
do you see any opportunities where we can look at those more general skills that people are learning and not force them into, well, this was your MOS, so this is your civilian sector?
I'm not sure. I'm the Skill Bridge program at DoD is, I mean, that's top notch. And I know a lot of folks who have both sides of the equation have really benefited from Skill Bridge. The companies and the nonprofits that are part of that program benefit from some incredibly talented people. And then those who are leveraging and have the opportunity to do that through the Skill Bridge program really get to see a picture of something that they may not have considered. To your point, they get to go somewhere and learn from in a way that really helps them. I don't know that I see anyone that's the real challenge is everybody's trying to do good. You're right. A lot of us are trying to help. How we bring those all together, I think, is always the big challenge. I don't think we should approach it from a standpoint that there needs to be one source. You're not going to boil the ocean. I mean, that's just a reality but knowing where to go and look. One criticism I have of the transition program, which has gotten incredibly, I really felt like I left the transition program gaining from it and getting something out of it. But I was committed to it, and I was also a colonel, so I had some control of my own time and schedule and everything else, right? But not everybody had the benefits that I had of doing that. But it's a one shot, one kill almost. It's 2-3 days. It's the typical military training, mandatory fun. That tends to lead to maybe a questionable attitude about your participation in it.
Right.
You don't, at the time you're doing it, you don't understand the merit of it, like so often has happened. The younger you are, you don't see the merit of it just because you're young. This is, what am I going to gain from this? And the criticism, twofold or criticism. I don't think they go into it with a mindset of, I just need to find a job, regardless of whether it's really what I want to do or not. I need to find a job. I'm panicked. I'm getting out. I don't know what to do next. If you have a family or kids, that adds to the stress. And you just settle, and instead of exploring really good opportunities. And I think we could do better about emphasizing that. But I also go back to my original statement is most of them are young kids, generally speaking, who I'm not sure what you could do to make it more attractive at the time, which gets to my second point of, I think we need to have more of a long-term follow-up, continue to provide. It can't just be a 3-day, one shot, one kill. Good luck on your transition. Hope it works out on the other side. Here's a list of resources. Go explore and learn. I mean, how do we make it where there's a 6-month, a 1 year, an 18-month, where you're checking in, where you're following up, where you're creating cohorts perhaps of people who, at the time it was like, oh, this sucks. 12 months later, when they're out there on their own, they're going, wow, I wish I'd have paid more attention. Yeah. And there's something then for them there. I don't know that answers your question, but
it does.
That's my observation in the transition program.
And I think what you're talking about would help with the code switching, right? You hold yourself, behave, speak. There's a very cultural way that you operate in the service that takes some time to get used to. When I was a staff sergeant, people did what I asked them to do. That was their job, right? Yeah. And then I go into higher education. I have to completely flip my leadership style, right? Like that doesn't work in higher education. The more I ask somebody to do something, the less they're probably going to want to do it, right? It's all about the collective leadership style. But there's a lot of examples of that code switching that I think do take that transition time that you talked about.
Yeah. So that's the hard part too, like the coding. I mean, how do you define yourself? You led with that, but how do you define, if you're really looking at like trying to code and change to ask the person who doesn't know to code themselves when they don't know what coding options, when I got out, I started at the American Council on Education, ACE. I was, a vice president or assistant vice president of leadership programs, and very involved and aware of their work and trying to translate military specialties into, actual collegiate credit, in a way that worked. But, that the biggest challenge is, defining that through an MOS definition or a specialty. You don't know what that individual, you might have how many times have you seen someone who had the specialty, or you ask someone, hey, so what was your MOS, military occupation specialty? For those of you who don't know what that is, that defines Marines and Army, particularly on what, it's a number. I was a 7563. What's that? It's a Huey pilot, but what, you take that and you break that down and you say, okay, well, other than the aviation skills of piloting and controlling an airplane, I was also the department head of a logistics department. I was a maintenance department head. I was, those all are part of that 7563. How do you break that out into that MOS? And then you say, well, I talk to people routinely. I say, what'd you do in the military? I was my MOS was a supply clerk, but once I got to my unit, they actually put me here and I did this, and I was contracting and I never carried an official title, but that's where all my expertise was in, and how do you code that?
Yep. And similar, and you started the conversation with this, but the softer, the durable skills, I can't imagine if you were on an interview and somebody asked you, do you work well under pressure? Do you have conflict management skills, right? Like all of those things that are just embedded in the decisions that you had to make every single day. And it's easy to take those for granted when you don't realize that other positions don't require that high level of some of those skills. Like you just know, you work well under pressure. You might not know that you have to articulate that in a different way to someone that doesn't understand what it was for you to do what you did when you did it.
It's a great point, Karen. And the other part of that is you were working with people around you that all had the same skills. So you don't give yourself that credit for that, because in your mind, I'm just like everybody else,
right,
that I'm used to. But in the civilian role, you aren't just like everybody else. You come in at a scalable level well above what a lot of the people around you will be working with, and with not just the skill, but the experience behind the skill. At least 4 years of experience with that skill, and typically more than 4 years, right? So you just don't credit yourself for those things, because I'm just like everybody else.
Mm-hmm. So when you brought up ACE, so if we shift the conversation just a little bit, and we talk about service members that do either want to finish a degree or get another degree, what do you want educators to know, whether it's, at the institution level or the faculty level? What do they need to know so they can better serve service members?
Well, for one thing, I think it's a great question I think knowing the community is helpful. And there are organizations like, I'm drawing a blank on them now, the Student Veterans of America, SVA. A ton of campuses, a good number of campuses have some type of a veteran community on, whether it's an SVA chapter, or a veteran focused programatics. I would really encourage them to interact with some of those programs and meet some of the people and hear the stories and, have those conversations of to hear what do you do? There's so many misnomers about what veteran means and what, and truthfully, unfortunately, a lot of that is a narrative that veterans are broken, they're PTSD riddled, and there are those who are struggling with that, but that doesn't and shouldn't define how people look at the veterans that they're interacting with, particularly professionally, and they should see what their opportunities are presenting are actually ways of helping those veterans prevent,
Right.
Their protective factors that help them avoid those types of things. But any way that they can interact in ways that perhaps they haven't, they should ask themselves a hard question. Do I know a veteran? Have I ever interacted with a veteran? Where can I go to find veterans? That's one, just at an informal method. I think formally, if they really are interested, they should be looking at establishing panels and bringing people in that can define it for them if they're truly looking to try to translate this information. And then looking at organizations like you all who are trying to make those inroads that, not only are you a veteran, but you're in practice and you've studied this academically and, you're credentialed because you wanted to be credentialed to do this.
Right.
Oh, if they're not bringing in organizations like you all that do that, they're missing a huge opportunity as well.
Okay. And what advice would you share? And this is probably a loaded question, so if it's not fair, let me know. But as you think about a new registrar or a new faculty member looking at a JST, looking at the ACE recommendation, how do they make meaning out of that? Like, what steps can they take to better understand what does 3UL actually mean?
Well, yeah, and you know what, you're actually, it's not a loaded question, but you're really tap dancing on the very edge of my understanding of a lot of these, more the details of a lot of these programs. So I'm somewhat hesitant because I could be, I haven't been at ACE in a long time. I don't know where their programs are by now. So I struggle with that aspect of it. My interpretation is by the time it gets to them, that translation has already occurred. If it's an academic, if it's at an academic institution, I kind of assumed, but I might be wrong. And, that's all being handled in the application process and what I get credits for, but if I misunderstand that, that's, like I said, you're walking me up against the edge of something that I just don't have a really good understanding of how it's used at the academic institution level at this point.
Okay. Then let's switch over to employers. Similar question. How can, and there are some out there, right, that are really taking steps forward to engage with the veteran community. But if somebody's trying to make heads and tails of a resume, or they really want to be military friendly from an employment standpoint, what advice would you give them?
I think a best practice that I've seen from a lot of organizations is, to have some type of an affinity group. Now, depending on where you're at and who you are, labeling an affinity or what, the label might be, I might be using a bad label right now, but the intent of an affinity group is, if they don't have a veteran group of that, the odds are there's veteran employees in there that they already have.
Right.
And if they're not leveraging some type of a group with those veterans that are there, that then can help them understand other veterans. So if they get a resume or and then you pull those members that are part of that into your hiring committees, into your screening, your evaluation committees, to help them translate that. If you're if you're a highly technical company and you're hiring an aeronautical engineer, I would assume that part of your hiring committee is going to have somebody who speaks aeronautic engineer on there. I think having a veteran, if you're truly committed to including veterans in your workforce, and you're not looking for ways to leverage the existing veterans and including them in the processes, you're missing an opportunity for expertise that resides right there with you.
How has your focus with small business entrepreneurs changed how you think about work success, credentials, degrees, all of it, all of the things that we think people need to have? Has it changed how you think about that?
Great question. Yes, in one very particular regard is that I really firmly believe that some of the people that, if you took a collective group of Americans that are ripe for success in entrepreneurship, for all the reasons we're talking about, it's veterans. They have, they just the very inherent nature of a veteran and what they've been through, that, adaptability, resilience, the ability to change, a hard drive for mission success, don't give up attitude, lean into it, just get to the other side. All requirements of a good entrepreneur, unfortunately,
yes.
it's a tough environment. And we all came out of that environment. We can succeed in that environment. And when I was transitioning, I looked at kind of, mandatory transition program. Oh, and then there's some voluntary, you can pick some other pathways if you're interested. I go back to what I said earlier. Okay, that means I have to spend more time doing this. I can't be in the office. If I'm a more junior person, I have to ask for that. And will my staff sergeant let me do that? Will my boss be irritated that I'm not in the office as I'm getting ready to get out? How will I be perceived? Why do I want to waste my time doing it? And I don't think we do a good enough job of defining to our members what some of the other options besides go find a job, write a resume, get to your next paycheck. The panic of I stopped getting paid on this day and I don't know what I'm going to do the next day to feed my children and my family, all that panic. We don't help feed what entrepreneurship looks like. So we rely on those who know what entrepreneurship is, maybe their parents or family, owned a small business or had success there, or the very rare people who are just like, I'm going to go for it, or then those who have an MBA or, have those previous credentials or, that type of thing that lends them to that. And I think we have the one thing I've really gained from my last several years, particularly in the profession I'm in and the industry I work in, is the merit of experience and how that translates to the potential for success as an entrepreneur in the veteran community. Whether you have the credentials you think you need or not, you have them. Say your rank. That rank gives you all the credentials you need, whether it's corporal or sergeant or seaman or, petty officer first class. That's the credential you need to think about being an entrepreneur.
Awesome. What do you think is one thing, like if there was just one thing that could change how we improve either military transition into an education environment or a work environment or an entrepreneurial environment, what could that one lever be?
Ooh. One thing. I think I'd go back to what I suggested before is create the system of follow-up and engagement, make it a long-term transition process. Both sides of the transition point too, by the way. a change in mindset on the military side that says a 1 year out is okay for people to, you're not being disloyal to the organization by thinking about getting out 1 or 2 years in advance. Some of the services I think do a better job than that than others. My service, you're disloyal, what are you thinking about getting out? You get out when you get out, and until then,
Yeah.
you're mine type attitude. We need to fix that on one end, but then once the transition has occurred, continuing to stay engaged, cohort based, orientation, maybe around the areas of interest and specialty. That's where I think stretching this process out on both ends of that transition cycle, whether you're talking job related, whether employee development related, or entrepreneurial or trade school or whatever that pathway is, but we got to extend it and make it a longer engagement.
Yeah. And one of the things that you said earlier, wrote down because it really stood out to me, but you talked about the protective factors. And it seems like what you talked about is really bringing everything together, because the better we can support all of our service members, whether they do have PTSD or they don't, is to help them understand their value. Because when you understand your value, those things aren't as big. I'm not going to say they go away, but they're not as big. So the more that we can do like you said, on both sides,
Yeah.
to acknowledge the value that everybody brings in whatever setting they're bringing, that is going to provide some of the protection to some of the sad numbers that we get to read about.
Yeah. In my transition, two of the I think the most valuable contributors that I had were a couple of different books that, and that understand what you're saying is helping understand your why, right?
Yeah.
I didn't understand my why when I transitioned, and I spent 27 very successful years in the Marine Corps, but I had no way of defining to myself what made me successful that was unrelated, that was beyond the definition of what I was doing as a military member. What was it about my core that beyond the definition as written in a fitness report or as a MOS descriptor that I was going to be able to carry with me into my civilian life? There's a consistency there. There's a thread. Yeah. And that's what you're getting at, is helping people understand that and their value, and not having it defined specifically in military terms. And that was really that defined the struggle that I mentioned to you for a number of years. And that's not inconsistent with most military members. How many jump from job to job in the first 3 to 4 years of their transition. And if we can help them understand that value,
mm-hmm.
It's going to protect them and get them to a better place. So when I talk with people in transition, I really focus them on breaking down what, and some, some of those books, Simon Sinek, Start With Why, some of Jim Collins' work, Good to Great, if you're a nonprofit, just different things to help you think about what is it about your core and what are the special elements of your core that make you unique. Okay, that made you successful in the military, or maybe it didn't make you successful. Maybe it made you not want to be in the military anymore, too, right? But what is it about me that I can then understand as I go forward? We do not do a good job in the military of helping military members understand what the core values of who they are and how that translates, right, even within the military, of their next moves, their next set of orders that would help them then in their last and final set of orders into the civilian world.
Right. I feel like we could talk about this forever.
Yeah, me too.
But as we start to bring this to a close, is there anything that you want our listeners to hear today that you haven't been able to share yet?
Well, I think it's really what you and I just talked about. Whether you feel it or not, you have value.
Yeah.
You are worth something, and you're incredibly unique. And if you don't feel like that's the case, then you need to take a second look. You need to find somebody to help you discover that, or find the right book if you're a reader, or find the right coach or mentor. And you don't have to pay for coaches and mentors. I'm talking about find people on LinkedIn or whatever your resource is, those who've gone before you.
Yeah.
But start with an understanding that if you don't feel that value, you don't see it, then you need to discover it. Don't assume it doesn't exist. To me, that's the heart of it. That you matter, people matter, and that contributes to what you're going to do next. And you can thrive no matter who you are, what past mistakes you've made, what struggles you may have had in the military or anywhere else. What you're walking away from, you have gained value.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So if people want to get in touch with you, is there any way that you'd like for them to reach out?
Sure. They can, if they're looking at entrepreneurial level work, particularly federal contracting type work, that's where my expertise and my organization, that's NVSBC, National Veteran Small Business Coalition. The website is www.nvsbc.org. But if they're looking to connect with me individually, my email is scott.jensen@nvsbc.org. I think the title's right there under my name, so you can look at that. But you can also connect on LinkedIn, and if you don't have LinkedIn, get LinkedIn. I mean, you gotta, right? I mean, so start with that. And I'm easy to find, Scott Jensen. There's a lot of Scott Jensens out there, but none of them look like me. So you should be able to find me either way.
Thank you, Scott, for joining us today. And thank you to everyone who's either watching or listening. I think seeking to understand is the competency that we all heard a lot about today. So have a great day and continue to understand each other's, try to translate our vocabulary and understand where we're all coming from. Thank you.